As we have said, the new bill introduced this week by Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Ilhan Omar, as well as a number of other members of the House of Representatives, will cancel all student debt in the United States, all of it. Now, people keep saying things, those who object to this bill, like, but we can't afford it, or what would that do to the economy, or that isn't fair, things of that nature. So here to join us now on this and other topics is a person who arguably knows as much as anybody about the macroeconomic effects of canceling all student debt. That is to say, the effect of canceling all student debt on the entire economy, because she was the lead author of a paper that looked at exactly that for the Levy Institute. Stephanie Kelton is a professor of economics and public policy at the State University of New York in Stony Brook. She is a leading expert on what is known as modern monetary theory. She's former chief economist of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee for the Democratic staff. She's been named by Politico as one of the 50 people most influencing the policy debate in the country. She's been on the program before, and she joins us now. So first of all, Stephanie, thanks for coming back on the program.
Happy to be back.
Secondly, student debt, $1.6 trillion owned or owed by more than, 46 million people, give or take, in this country, for giving it all. A good economic idea or a bad one?
Well, I think it's a good economic idea. At least that's what the data bears out. And I think it's both, logical at some level. I think, if you asked people, suppose you had 45 million people who, every month had to take out their checkbook and repay student loan debt. What do you think would happen if, instead of taking out the checkbook and writing a $500, $600, sometimes more than $1,000 check to repay student loan debt, what if they could keep that money and do something else? What do you think would happen? I think most people's instincts would lead them to say, oh, they probably spend it in other ways, right? And so that turns out to be the case. And what we did, my colleagues and I, in this research paper that we published, as you mentioned, with the Levy Economics Institute, was just to ask this hypothetical question. It was really not intended as a policy proposal per se, but more of a, I wonder what would happen if sort of exercise. And so what we did was model the macroeconomic effects of canceling, wiping out what then was 1.4 trillion. See, it's been about a year and the problem continues to metastasize. So now we're at 1.6. But we let the macroeconomic models answer the question for us. Would it be economically beneficial to do this? To, I guess, no one's surprise, at least the economists who did the research, the answer the models gave us was yes, there would be a variety of benefits to the economy as people were able to spend that money in other ways.
And you used, just to be clear, you didn't use fringy, out there economic models. You used the standard tools that people use to measure the effect of something like this, right? So
that's right. We did not use the unicorn model.
Right.
We worked actually, we were fortunate. We got to work with Mark Zandi at Moody's, and Zandi Analytics. They've got some models that they've developed over the years to run these kinds of simulations. So we worked with Mark and his staff, and we used his model. And then to make sure that the results were really robust, we wanted an answer from another conventional macroeconomic model, and this one's known as the FAIR model. Its creator is Ray Fair. He's an economist at Yale. And so both of the models supplied us with an opportunity to ask the question and get answers, from two different standard macroeconomic models.
And there's something I wanted to get out on the table in this conversation, because we're talking, Stephanie Kelton, about the fact that canceling this $1.6 trillion in student debt would help the economy grow. And I just want people to understand, because we've heard a lot of Republican talk, certainly, that canceling or let's say giving a tax break for 1.5 trillion to the wealthiest Americans was going to be great for the economy. But I think, I mean, you tell me from a technical point of view, it seems to me common sense would say, yeah, but that's going to billionaires who are just going to put it in the bank anyway, so it's not going to help create jobs. But the people who are getting, who would get this student debt cancellation will go out and they'll go to restaurants, they'll buy homes, they'll get a car, they'll do things that actually create jobs. But that's just my lay interpretation of it. What is the technical response to that?
Well, that's pretty good, Richard. I mean, yeah, so in a way, what the Republicans did was a form of cancellation, right? Because you had all these corporations and taxpayers, especially those at the upper end of the income distribution, who were scheduled to make higher tax payments under the old tax rates. And then the tax rates were adjusted. And it's effectively canceling the payments that would have been due under the old regime. And so it is in many ways like a form of cancellation, except that 83 or so percent of the benefits in terms of the individual tax cuts went to people in the top 1% of the income distribution. And then, of course, you had the corporate tax cuts as well. So, you know, it's sort of common sense in a way, I think, to say that if you give a huge windfall to the people who already are doing extraordinarily well, do you think those are the people who are going to go out and say, oh, the car's been breaking down on me. I'm finally in a position to go out and, you know, now I can afford a car payment. So I'm going to replace that old beat up car. Now I can finally get the refrigerator that's been on the fritz, or the washing machine. You know, I can finally afford to do these things. Look, these people in the top 1% are consuming about as much as they want to consume, and throwing some additional disposable income their way tends not to boost their consumption very much, because they can already afford to meet whatever their consumption needs and desires are. So if you're disproportionately sending the benefits of the tax cuts to the people who are least likely to turn around and spend that income back into the economy, then it's probably not much of a surprise that the tax cuts that were touted as this great, you know, boon for the economy that was going to rain jobs and boost wages and have all of these, you know, spillover or trickle down effects to people, you know, through the income distribution didn't quite work that way.
Well, and it was a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this study, but I saw a study a few years ago saying that the uppermost income brackets in the country and in the world actually have so much money on hand that they're not even investing, much less spending new money that they get, new income that they get, because they've not only spent everything they can think of to spend, but they've basically invested as much as they wanted to invest. I'm trying to remember the study now, which I shouldn't do on the fly, but basically that the ultra wealthy are so glutted with money that it's really giving them more, as the Trump tax cut did.
So you're saying they have so many Lamborghinis and so many properties scattered all over the world that they can't find the time to visit them all and drive them. They can't figure out what else to do. You give me more money, I'm simply out of things to do with it. That's a remarkable problem to have.
Right, but so we're saying that. So you're saying that this idea, which you studied in the abstract, of course, before Senator Sanders or Representative Omar came up with their bills, but you're saying that this idea is great for the economy in a way that, for example, the Trump tax cut is not. You're also saying that it would create anywhere from 1 million to 1 million something new jobs per year, according to your study and the models you used, for a period of several years, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the peak job creation is at about 1.5 million. That's in a single year at the height of the benefit from the cancellation. The average is something closer to about 1 million additional new jobs for the economy as a consequence of this. So, and you know, you mentioned the tax cuts again. In a way, canceling student loan debt does work like a tax cut in the sense that it leaves people with more income to spend. And so, it's through what economists call the income effect that relieving people of that debt service payment that they're making every month and allowing them to figure out what they'd like to do with that money instead. So it's tantamount in an economic way to a tax cut for some 45 million people, and then the spillover effects reach well beyond those who are receiving or benefiting from the tax cut itself. The indirect effects spill wider into the economy.
Well, and to me, that's a very important point, Stephanie Kelton, because it points to, I think, the argument that people are now making, now that it's part of the political debate because of the Sanders-Omar bill. People are saying, well, why do we want to help those relatively privileged college students, people who went to college? I mean, one obvious answer is that not everybody who owes student debt graduated from college. Some people didn't go to college at all. They went to trade schools or other universities, but other private institutions. But I guess the other side of that argument is it's not just benefiting those people, but it's benefiting the million and a half during the peak years of people who would get those new jobs who aren't necessarily college people at all, right?
Yeah. If you're working as a busboy or a waitress in a restaurant, and the people who have student loan debt, when they're surveyed about, people ask them, in what ways, if any, is the student loan debt that you have today impacting your lifestyle? And these surveys exist, and 2/3 of people with student loan debt say that the existence of the student loan debt is causing them to delay major purchases, home buying, car buying, and other major appliances. So they're putting that off. 2/3 of people, 4 in 10, 40%, say that student loan debt is the reason that they're postponing either getting married or starting a family. So, you work in I don't know if Babies R Us, I guess Babies R Us doesn't exist anymore, but, stores that sell strollers and things that people buy when they're starting a new family, crib bedding and furniture and all those sorts of things. Those are people who benefit when this wet blanket, when this burden is lifted, and all of a sudden people can get back to living again, to making the kinds of decisions, go out and buy the car, go out and, get married, buy a home, furnish a home, have some money to go out and eat. So I mentioned the waitress. Now, I have an extra $250 a month in my pocket. Normally I don't go out and eat, but now I feel like I can go out and eat, and I can, leave a more generous tip when I go out because I have a little bit of extra cash to work with. And so those are just some of the ways that people who aren't immediately relieved of student loan debt end up benefiting in other ways.
Well, I saw a meme on the internet the other day, and of course there's no more authoritative source of economic data in the world than memes on the internet. But it was a meme, I think, from the Bernie Sanders campaign, saying that's how over 400,000 young people have been would be more likely to form new households if student debt were canceled. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly there's a significant number out there. So in addition to the kinds of purchases you're talking about, that's also contractors and painters and,
absolutely, electricians, carpenters. Yeah. Years ago, when I was working in DC, actually, I ended up getting invited to come talk about this issue, which at the time I didn't know very much about at all, but I went over to the National Realtors Association. I might not be getting the name exactly right, but it's right there in DC. And, we were talking about the impact of student loan debt on home buying, and home builders, feel this. And the president of the association said at the time, this is a huge, huge deal for us. And I said, well, have you talked about it? And I was shocked that he said that they hadn't, as a potential lobbying issue, they had remained pretty quiet on this, in spite of the fact that he said it was really hurting them, and they recognized that. So, yeah, absolutely.
So, and last, maybe second to last question on this one. I know that one of your co-authors of the Levy Institute report on the the macro effect of canceling student debt also wrote that it would reduce the racial wealth gap in this country. I think he wrote by 12 to 1 to 5 to 1, which is, of course, still outrageous and needs to be addressed, but it would actually help the racial wealth gap to cancel all student debt in the country. Is that your understanding as well?
That's my read of his work. Yeah, his name is Marshall Steinbaum, and I think that was a piece that he co-authored with Julie Morgan, and I think I saw it on the Roosevelt Institute website. But I'm familiar with the piece, and yeah, that's what they found.
And we're talking again with Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. And Stephanie, I guess by way of transition to another topic at the same time, last question about student debt, which is, but we can't afford it. Yeah. We keep hearing we can't afford it. Now, of course, we don't hear from Republicans anyway, we can't afford it when it comes to a $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthiest people among us. And of course, we had Dick Cheney say back when he was vice president, deficits don't matter. But whenever we want to do something, it seems as if whenever we want to do something good for people, the consensus in Washington is, oh, we'd love to, but we can't afford that.
Yeah, we just ran out of money. It just happened right after the last thing we did.
You're right. The last money left.
Yeah.
So I understand, Bertie tells me, and your website tells me, and other sources, that you have a book coming out on the deficit myth. So what is it that, I know we've talked about this before, but what is it that we don't get about deficits in this country?
Wow, a lot. That's why there's a whole book with more than one chapter.
Sorry.
we just get so much wrong, Richard. I mean, everything from, I guess the problems really begin when we think of the federal government like a giant household that's subject to the same sort of constraints and rules of the game that you and I are subject to. And if we have to balance our budget every month and sit around the kitchen table, that metaphorical place where the income and the expenditures have to match up at the end of every month, then by God, the federal government ought to have to do it too. And we see them behaving in ways that are incompatible with how we exist in our own financial world. And it just looks to us like they're just doing a terrible job. Why can't they live within their means? Why are they, quote, overspending? Why are they fiscally irresponsible? Why can't they just balance their budgets if I can do it? And so really, I think the problems start there. They don't end there, but that's really the beginning place, that tendency that we have, and it's reinforced around us in the press, in the financial media, on the nightly news, in the town halls, and our public officials, pundits. It's drilled into us constantly that the government has some sort of a budget or fiscal problem, and then everybody just sort of assumes that must be correct because that's the only thing they've ever heard anybody say. So the deficit myth tries to unravel a lot of the faulty thinking that lies behind the belief that the federal government of the United States could end up broke, could end up like, what we saw happen in Greece or some of the European countries, or that we're somehow dependent on China as our banker, and that there's this disaster out there looming if we don't begin to attack programs like Social Security and Medicare, because they tell us that our so-called entitlement programs are driving a long-term fiscal crisis. So that's a long answer to what seems like an easy question, but there's so much that we get wrong.
See, and of course, needless to say, I don't know what you know about this topic, but I do know how much it used to bug me when politicians, especially Democratic politicians, would start talking about that. Folks, first of all, as soon as politicians start using the word folks, my BS meter just goes through the roof. And when they would say, folks, we just got to treat it like folks sitting around the kitchen table got to benefit First of all, when I sit around the metaphorical kitchen table with my family, I'm not able to issue a sovereign currency. I can't issue Eskows to pay for it. I have to use dollars that were issued by somebody else. So I have to get them, and if I run out of them, I have a problem. So that always struck me. I've even written about that back in the day when Obama was talking about that during the grand bargain negotiations. But and obviously, I'm not asking you to summarize an entire book in a single conversation. But let's use the example of student debt. People say we can't afford the 1.6 trillion it would take to cancel student debt. Well, first of all, I guess I'm not even sure it's an expenditure because you don't have to write checks to anybody, since most of that debt is held or guaranteed by the government. You're just not going to get the checks in return. So to me, it strikes me as kind of an accounting thing rather than a disbursement of funds thing. And I don't know if that matters in this conversation at all. But secondly, it's like, well, if we had the money for the rich people's tax cuts, why don't we have the money for this?
So yeah, a lot of it is to cancel student loan debt. A lot of it is just saying to people who would be paying back student loans that the federal government holds. And so that part works like a tax cut. It's like, okay, you owed us this money, and now we're saying just keep it. You don't have to pay it back. So, you got 1.6 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. The disproportionate share of that, over $1 trillion, is owed to the federal government. So that part, they just say, don't pay it back. There is some portion of it, though, that was privately issued debt. And so borrowers are paying back private lenders. And so to cancel that portion of it, the federal government could either buy the debt outright or make the payments on behalf of borrowers. And so if they ended up doing that, which is how we simulated it in our report, the federal government takes over the payments, then that's where you do get an expenditure. But the question about, affordability goes right to the heart of what you started to say. You can't issue Eskows. Well, these payments have to be due in US dollars. It's the only way you can pay them back is with the US dollar. And it just so happens that the only entity on earth with the legal authority to issue the US dollar is the US government. So we say in MMT that the federal government is the issuer of the currency. And because the US dollar comes from the US government and can't come from anywhere else, it means the federal government can never run into a situation where it has a bill that needs to be paid and it can't afford to pay it. Right? Not like a household. It can meet any financial obligation it has, provided that the obligation is due in its own currency, which means the federal government, unlike us, never has to worry about the question, where will I find the money? How will I pay for it? That's the easy part, it turns out. The hard part is figuring out how to best take advantage of your power, your authority over your currency, how to exercise that power in a responsible and efficient way so that you're investing in the kinds of things that give the broadest benefit to the economy, right? And serve some public purpose rather than producing windfalls for people at the very top.
So it's a matter of, if I understand you correctly, it's a matter of what resources best belong where and what the government can do to encourage that for the best outcome for the most people, as opposed to a sort of artificial limitation based on a belief that there's a limited amount of dollars out there that then somehow always seems to wind up benefiting the Wall Street rather than the public. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, I know, but is there...
No, you're not. I mean, that's it. If you're the issuer of the currency, then you are not financially constrained in that currency. Look, if you're Delta Airlines, you can issue all the Delta Sky Miles that you want. You give people a certain number of miles for every dollar they spend on your card. You could double that. You could triple that. You could quadruple that. You can give them many points as you want. You're the issuer of the Sky Miles. They can only come from you. The question is, how many do you want to distribute so that people can access those points, use them to take trips and still remain profitable, right? Because there are enough seats available to sell to customers who are paying for those seats. So in the US case, the US government is not constrained in terms of how many dollars it can spend, right? The question is, how many dollars can it safely spend? Because our economy is resource constrained. We only have so many people that can be hired. We only have so many machines and factories, raw materials, lumber, steel. There's only so much real stuff. And so if the federal government tries to flex its fiscal muscle and take too many of the economy's resources, it's going to end up pushing things too far, right? Competing with other private sector uses for those resources, and then you're going to end up with an inflation problem.
So, when I hear people talking about modern monetary theory, and it seems to be, a hot topic in certain circles, including having attracted an impressive, both in number and in pedigree, a series of antagonists or enemies. But what I hear first, I heard people say, well, it's not reality based. Then I heard people say, well, it's reality based in the sense that it recognizes if you create too much money, you'll get inflation. But I hear you saying more than that. Okay, I hear you say, yes, inflation is a real possibility, but to use the frequent flyer miles example, American Airlines can't run out of frequent flyer miles. They can issue as many as it wants, but if it issued 100 million frequent flyer miles to 10 million people, it would run out of seats. So the constraint is not just frequent flyer mile inflation, it's there are only so many seats in the airline, just as there are only so much in resources in the economy. And if you don't think of that in your planning, then you're going to run into trouble. Am I on the right track?
That's it exactly. We were talking about the waitress earlier. If you overdo things, you're going to have a line wrapped around the restaurant and very agitated people who want a booth, and there's not a booth available, and the wait time is going to get longer and longer, and the chefs are going to be stressing out, and the prices are going to go up on the menu because the business is not going to be able to accommodate all of that demand given the limited seating and the ability of the staff to, it takes people a half an hour to finish a meal and get out of there in the next one. You know what I mean? So the constraints are there. They're in our real economy, and pushing spending. It's not about printing money per se. It's about the amount of spending that the economy can absorb and handle by stepping up with new production. So if you've got a business that's eager, that would just love to have more customers, that's a great thing. It gives you space in your economy to allow people to have higher incomes and do more spending because businesses are able to keep up with that higher demand, meeting it with higher supply. But at some point, you begin to run into resource constraints, and then that's reflected in rising prices. So that's the legitimate constraint that has to be respected.
So why do you think it is, and maybe we'll make this our wrap-up question, why do you think it is that there's such heated debate around, in certain circles, economic circles and so on, around modern monetary theory? I mean, intuitively, it seems to make sense to me. But even if it didn't, and even if you're academically, and I know you have a lot of economists for it and some against it, but whoever you are, whether you're a financial writer, whether you're an economist, in this debate, why do you think it stimulates? Well, it's got passionate advocates too, and why does it stimulate such passion on both sides, do you think?
Look, I think there are a lot of ways I could answer it, but the one big answer, I think, to your question is that for the most part, the discipline, economists, for now 20 plus years, have bought completely into the idea that policy is best run through independent central banks. And in other words, monetary policy as opposed to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is what Congress does or what Parliament does in the UK, right? It's the spending and the tax piece of policy. Monetary policy is what the Fed does. And that's mostly about just changing interest rates. And so you have these two levers through which to work economic policy. And for 20 plus years, economics has gravitated to a position that says that monetary policy alone can steer the economy. All you need is a credible central bank committed to anchoring inflation expectations. God, this could get wonky. And the central bank can do it all. Just give them the interest rate, leave them alone, let them be independent, don't interfere, right? Like Donald Trump. And they will do a very good job of giving you an economy that has high levels of employment and stable inflation. Well, MMT comes along and starts pushing the conversation in a different direction, which is toward greater reliance on fiscal policy to help produce a good economy. And there are just a lot of economists who are wedded to these models that center policymaking with the independent central bank and think that Congress should just restrict itself to trying to balance its budget and otherwise leave the management of the economy to the independent and, I will add, not democratically elected, right? They're technocrats.
Right.
And that they ought to be in charge.
And I would add that the governor, the power structure of the Federal Reserve is deeply intertwined with the big banks of this country. At one point in the recovery after the financial crisis, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of arguably the largest and certainly one of the most scandal-ridden financial institutions in the world, was actually head of the Human Resources Committee at the Federal Reserve that determined had final say on everybody's salary. So my friend William Greider, when he wrote his book on the Federal Reserve, called it Secrets of the Temple. So I guess there's a theological side to all of this too. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but Stephanie Kelton, professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University and author of the upcoming book, The Deficit Myth. I'm told that pre-orders help an author a lot. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. People seem pretty excited about the book, and so that's terrific. I think pre-orders are doing pretty well.
Okay, good, because I'm told that benefits everywhere. So that's my economic insight for the day. But okay, Stephanie Kelton, as always, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.